Hi guys, welcome to today's video. So today's lesson will be focused on 1.6, which is representing functions as rules and tables. So let's start by taking a look at some vocab. So this lesson will have a bunch of vocab. So this one has 6 vocabulary words that we need to take a look at. So that's quite a lot. So let's start with the first one. The first one is a function. So what is a function? A function is a pairing of inputs and outputs such that each input, right, is paired with exactly one output. So what does that all that mumbo jumbo means? So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this example right here, right? So the inputs, right? The inputs are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the outputs are 0, 1, and 2. So a function, right? For something to be a function means that each input, you guys can see here, goes to, is paired with exactly just one output, right? So for example, 1 to 0, 2 to 1, right? And 3 to 2, and 4 to 2. Right? So that's an example of a function. So let's take a look at the second vocab word, which is the domain, right? So what is a domain? So a domain is a set of numbers containing inputs. So that could be something like this, right? It could be something like x is equal to 1, 2, 3, and 4. That would be an example of a domain, right? And x here represents the input or the domain. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's see, the third vocab word is range. So what is a range? A range is a set of numbers containing outputs. So another example would be y is equal to 0, 2, 4, 6. Right? So that would be an example of a range. And a range is outputs, which is y, 0, 2, 4, and 6. So I'll explain it again. I'll explain that a little bit more later. But let's take a look at the number 4, the fourth vocab word, which is mapping diagram. And what is a mapping diagram? It's a way to represent a function. So this right here, this example that I referred to is called a mapping diagram. Right? And it shows inputs and outputs. So it's basically, it's like the inputs are mapping onto the outputs, right? They're going from here to there. That's represented by the arrow right there. So the fifth vocab word is called an independent variable, right? Independent variable means the input variable, what we put in. So x, right, represents the independent variable, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's what we put in. And then the dependent variable here is the output variable. And that's what we get out, which is y, which is 0, 2, 4, and 6. Right? So that's the example. So here's an example of like what an independent variable and dependent variable is. So an independent variable, right, is how fast do I run, right? How fast do I run? And the dependent variable in that case is how tall I am, right? So for example, if I'm at this height, if I'm taller right here, I would run faster. If I'm shorter right here, I would run slower. Right? So the dependent variable, it depends, right? The dependent has the word depend on it. So it depends. It's what like changes, right? So for example, how fast I run. That's the thing that we're studying, right? That's the independent variable. And dependent variable is like the factors that can affect it, right? Like how tall I am affects how I run, right? How tall I am, if I'm wearing a backpack, right? If I'm not wearing shoes, if I'm wearing shoes. Those are examples of dependent variables, right? It's things that can change. I mean, the dependent variables are things that can change. This, right, how fast I run cannot change. It's the independent variable. So that's basically what all this vocab means. So let's take a look at the key concept, right? The key concept for this lesson. And again, we're talking about functions. So there's 3 things that we need to look at. The first one's called the verbal rule. That's the first way that we can represent a function. An example is the output is 3 more than the input, right? So you guys remember from the previous lessons, 3 more than is addition. It represents addition, more than the input. Okay, so a way to represent this function is an equation, right? So in the equation we can say the output. So the output is always y, right? The output is always y, and the input is always x in this case. And it can be any other variable too, right? It can be like whatever you say. So for example, it could be instead of y is equal to x plus 3, it could be, for example, m is equal to n plus 3. It could be like that too. So the variables here are not like concrete. You can change those up if you want to. So in this case, the equation is y is equal to x plus 3. And from there, the third thing for the functions, right, is you can form a table out of it. So now that we have this equation over here, we know that the inputs are x and the outputs are y. Right? So for example, let's consider the inputs, right, the x to be 0, 1, 2, and 3. Right? So what do we get out of it? So if we plug this into, right, if we plug 0 into here, right, plug 0 into there, what do we get? So let's do that out right here real quick. Y is equal to, so let's suppose x is equal to 0. 0 plus 3. Well, what do we get? Well, we get y is equal to 3, which is right here, right? And if we plug that in, right, we plug 1 1 in for x, 2 in for x, 3 in for x, we get out these outputs right here, right? So we plug 1 into x, we get 4, 2 into x, we get 5, 3 into x, we get 6. So that's basically how a table works and how like you can fill in a table if you're asked to do so. So let's take a look at the first example for this lesson, right? Example 1 says to identify the domain and range. So let's take a look at it. We have the inputs here are gallons, right? Inputs or gallons are 10, 12, and 13. Outputs are dollars. Whoops, we got a parentheses there. Are 19.99, 23.99, and 25.99. Right? So let's identify the domain and range. So remember from the vocab, right? The vocab at the beginning of the video. Inputs are the same thing as the domain, and outputs are the same things as range, right? So what do we know? So they gave us the inputs, right? So they basically gave us the domain. So the domain right here is right there. So the domain would be 10, 12, and 13. And outputs are the same thing again as range, right? So they gave us the outputs again. So what are the outputs in this case? It's 19.99, 23.99, and 25.99, right? Those are the outputs. So this one's pretty easy, right? So those two right there, right? First one's domain, inputs, range is outputs. Simple? Okay, second example and final example for this video. It says to write a rule for the function. So this one's a little bit more difficult, right? We had to first identify like the equation first, right? They gave us this table right here, and then we had to write an equation for it. So an equation is basically the same as saying writing a rule. So what did they give us? The inputs are 0, 1, 4, and 6, and the outputs are 2, 3, 6, and 8. So the first step, right? The first step we identify, like based on the problem-solving plan, right? Is what do we know? We know the inputs. They gave us that. We know the outputs. They gave us that. What don't we know? We want to know what the rule is, the equation. What is the equation? So what do we do? Well, we're going to have to identify the relationship between the two, right? Between the inputs and outputs. So let's take a look. 0 and 2. What's the difference between those two? So there's a gap of 2. 1 and 3. What's the difference between those? 2. 4 and 6, there's another gap of 2. 6 and 8, there's another gap of 2. So you can see there's a trend here. There's a pattern. So you can see there's between the output and input. So the output seems like there's more than 2, right? The outputs are 2 more than the inputs. So that means, right? So let's suppose the outputs are y again. We can represent this. We can write a rule for this as x. The y is equal to x plus 2. Right? So again, this one's a little bit more difficult example. So you guys practice and go through it, you'll know how to write rules or equations for the functions. So thank you guys for joining me in this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.